Well, greetings out there in YouTube land, and welcome to today's big video, which features the contents of this rather large shipping box. And if this box contains what I think it does, this is going to be one of the more significant and interesting videos that we've ever made. So with that possibility in mind, let's get the box open and see what awaits us inside. Well, right off the bat, we see that it's very nicely and securely wrapped, and we have our letter from the owner, which I'll set aside for now and we'll read in just a few minutes. Well, after a little excavation, I see that whatever this amp is, it has reverb and enough tubes to fill 2 boxes. So let's get this stuff out of the way and keep digging. Well, here it is. I'm going to keep you in suspense for another minute or two, as if you haven't already seen the title of the video, as we survey what we all know is the underside of the chassis. It's got the doghouse, it's got 6 preamp tubes, that's going to be the reverb driver. You know, from the looks of the difference in screw heads, I'm thinking that the output transformer has been changed, and also that vinyl, very clean wire there. We'll check into it. It is a Fender output transformer, but we'll look into that after we've checked everything else out. Filter choke and a power transformer. The numbers check out on these 2 transformers. We see here that the amplifier was built in 1963. And that's a major clue. So this is going to be a Brownface amp. We see also that just from our forensic observations that it would appear to me that this 6L6 was biased hotter than this one. We're going to see that we have a GZ34 rectifier tube. And so now let's lift it up and look at the control panel. Here is our control panel. It is, as we expected, a Brownface. We see that we have no mid-range control in the normal channel. And then we have a bright channel, okay, not vibrato, but bright. We have 3 controls here with no mid-range. We've got reverb, intensity and speed for a tremolo, and yes, indeed, this is a 1963 Vibroverb, okay, quite possibly the rarest and most valuable amp that Fender ever built. The inside of the chassis is spectacularly original, untouched by drunken chimps or human hands, it would appear, other than when I think the output transformer was probably changed. We'll have to check into that. Okay, but for now, behold something that mere mortals rarely, if ever, get a chance to see in person. Okay, totally impressive. Let's spin it around and take a look at the back control panel. One of the highlights of my day is finding an intact Underwriter Laboratory sticker, a 3-digit serial number. As we're going to find out when I talk about the history of this amp, it depends on who you ask. We're either less than 600 or less than 500 of these ever made. Apparently this one was made right in the middle of that run. I don't think you're ever going to see a serial number quite like that again. And look at the flawless brown rear control panel. And it appears that we may have an original power cord. I'm not familiar with the like 2-strand cords like this, but boy is this one old. Okay, it's stiffer than my joints on a cold morning, and I can't believe this plug it would be original. But anyway, as you can see, based on observation, this jewel is as nice and original as it needs to be, other than, like I said, the output transformer. Okay, so there it is. I'll need to check with the owner to see if he has the original output transformer, because on an amp like this that's worth more than the first house I bought, I think it would be best to have all original components, and he could probably get that rewound. But let's move on now and have a discussion of the evolution of this amplifier and its significance to music lovers everywhere. The Vibroverb amp first appeared in February of 1963 in this Brownface configuration. In 1964, it was released in a Blackface version and then was discontinued toward the end of 1964. So this amp was only produced for actually less than 2 years, unlike some other models, I mean like the Deluxe Reverb and all that have been with us for several decades. Okay, so that's part of the explanation for the very high value, is they're extremely rare. As I said initially, the estimate on these is probably around 500 or less were ever made, and God knows how many of those survived, probably less than half. So in the whole world of, what do we have, 4 or 5 billion people, you've got around 250 vibroverbs to go around. The Brownface vibroverbs used a 6G16 circuit. Okay, this changed to a AA 763 circuit for the Blackface Vibroverb. We'll discuss the differences between the Brownface and Blackface versions, and we'll also see what's rather unique about this amp and probably why those changes were made for the Blackface version. Now let's take a look at the schematic of the Fender 6G16 Vibroverb and see what makes it unique. First off will be the tremolo circuit. Now, before we discuss what's really unusual about the Brownface Vibroverb tremolo, let's talk about the 3 different types of tremolo that we find in vintage amplifiers. Number 1 is the bias modulating type. This generally uses a very basic oscillator. It can be 1 or 2 triodes of a 12AX7 tube. It's the type of tremolo that we see in the 5G3 Deluxe and the Princeton Reverb. And the way it works is to modulate rhythmically the bias of the output tubes. Now, in this particular case with the bias modulating tremolo, it will only be used with sort of lower output tubes like 6V6s. We also see this type of tremolo in the Vibrochamp, but instead of modulating the bias of the output tubes, it modulates the cathode bias of one of the preamp tubes. The second type we see is the volume or signal modulating tremolo, and that uses what is the nickname the Roach, also called an opto-isolator and or a photoresistor type of oscillator. We find this in the Deluxe Reverb, Pro Reverb, and Bandmaster. Now the way it works is not to modulate the bias of the output tubes. Instead, it's inserted into the signal generally just before the phase inverter, and it actually modulates the volume of the signal. It's very much like you were to grab a hold of the volume knob of the amp and turn it up and down, say 3 or 4 times a second to achieve your tremolo effect. Now this type of tremolo is used with much more powerful output tubes like the 6L6GC. The reason that you do not use a bias modulating tremolo with 6L6s is they operate at such a high level of plate voltage and plate current that modulating the bias of the tubes will prematurely wear them out and end up with shortened tube life. The third type that's much less often seen is the so-called harmonic tremolo that we see in amps like the Brownface Concert, in which use actually 3 tubes to achieve both a tremolo and a vibrato effect. Okay, but the two that relate to the issue here with the Brownface Vibroverb tremolo are the bias modulating and volume or signal modulating. So keep those types in mind now as we look at the schematic of the tremolo circuit. Here we have the schematic of the Fender Brownface Vibroverb Model 6G16, like the one that we're working on here on the workbench. You see the oscillator circuit for the tremolo right here using both triodes of a 12AX7. This is very similar to the oscillator circuit that's used in the Vibrochamp. Remember that the Vibrochamp would modulate the cathode bias of one of the preamp tubes. In this case, however, and this is where things get kind of strange, is they're going to use this oscillator to modulate the bias of the grids of the 6L6GC output tubes. Now, if you recall, I just told you that that does not work well because these tubes operate at such a high plate voltage and current that once you start modulating the negative DC grid bias of the tubes, you will prematurely age them, stress them, and they will fail rather quickly. So what we see here is a really good example of a bias modulating tremolo being applied to the wrong output tubes. Now, I said earlier that there were only like 500 or maybe up to 600 of these amps ever built. And I'm wondering if this isn't part of the reason, because it's going to use up the output tubes fairly quickly, okay, and cause some issues. I'm not sure how well the tremolo works. We'll find out, because after I've fixed this one up, we're definitely going to have a good audio demo of it. But this is just not an acceptable practice, and may have contributed to the short run here on of the Brownface 6G16 Vibroverb. Further evidence exists in that when you look at the AB763 schematic of the Blackface Vibroverb, they very quickly changed from the duo-triode type of oscillator to the opto-isolator photoresistor type of oscillator unit, and instead of applying it to the grids of the output tubes, it modulated the volume of the vibrato channel. This is the type of tremolo, the more modern and successful type that we see in the deluxe reverb and other amps of that sort. So I think that the Vibroverb Brownface was where Fender first discovered that you cannot apply bias modulating tremolo to 6L6GC tubes. I'm betting they had a lot of problems with it, and they very quickly changed to this type of oscillator circuit, modulating the volume of the signal, not the bias of the output tubes. And you know darn well that Fender would not spend money on extra components for his oscillator circuit. If he could have gotten by with a single 12AX7, he would have done it. So when you see this added complexity and expense, you must realize that it had to be fully justified. Now let's talk about a few more peculiarities of this Brownface circuit. Number one is, since you're applying the tremolo effect, the bias modulation to the output tubes, the tremolo effect will be present on both channels. And that's why I think they call this channel bright instead of vibrato, because if it were labeled vibrato, you'd figure, oh well, that's the tremolo channel and this is the normal channel. So when you have tremolo in both channels, they had to modify the name, so it's normal and bright. That is rather unusual. Number two, we see no brightness switches for either the normal or the bright channel. Okay, we're going to see in later circuits, including the Blackface circuit, that we start to see bright switches. And there is no mid-frequency tone control on either channel. Here is the Blackface schematic. You see that now, since the tremolo is only applied to the vibrato channel, it is called the vibrato channel, not the bright channel. And we see we have a bright switch here and a bright switch here, which gives you a little more tone control than you would have had with the Brownface circuit. We'll see another evolutionary step taken in the reverb circuit. The Brownface uses a two triodes of a 12AX7 gang together to drive the reverb tank. I think this didn't work as well as they hoped, and they switched to the much more common and effective use of the 12AT7 triodes gang together to drive the reverb tank. I really think these two circuits show some very dramatic changes in Fender. He starts off sort of like as a test bed with this Brownface circuit, and then quickly finds there's errors and ways to improve it, and he updates it to the Blackface version. The long tail pair phase inverters are the same for both versions of the Vibroverb circuit. We see that they both use a GZ34 rectifier tube, but the method of filtering in the power supply is very different between the two. Let's discuss that in some detail. In the Brownface version, we see that the standby switch precedes all of the filter caps. Now, the downside of that is that when you turn the amp on and you have the standby switch open, as you normally would, the high voltage has absolutely nowhere to go, and it cannot charge any of the filter caps. Compare that to the Blackface version of the circuit. The standby switch is after the reservoir capacitors and before the three filter caps. The benefit of this is that even if the standby switch is open, when you turn on the amp, the high voltage is able to go in here and charge up these reservoir caps. Then when you close the standby switch, there are only 1, 2, 3 filter caps to be charged. Looking at the Brownface circuit, we see that once you close the standby switch, there'll be a really high current flow to fully charge 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 electrolytic capacitors. Okay, now that could stress your rectifier tube and lead to early failure. Once again, I think that Fender experimented with this type of arrangement for the standby switch and decided that placing the standby switch after the reservoir capacitors, as he has done here in the Blackface version, and in virtually every subsequent circuit design, was definitely the best way to go. And while we're at it, let's look at the reservoir caps and filter caps for the Brownface circuit. For reservoir capacitance, we see two 16 microfarad at 450 volt capacitors in parallel, which gives a net capacitance of 32 microfarads at 450 volts. After the filter choke, we see 3 16 at 450 filter caps. Now let's take a look at the Blackface circuit. Here we see the far more traditional approach to reservoir capacitance, and that is two 70 microfarad at 350 volt capacitors in series, which yields a 35 microfarad at 700 volt reservoir capacitance. And we see here with the 3 post filter choke filter caps that all 3 are no longer 16 at 450 but 20 at 525. So what I think we're seeing here between the reservoir capacitance alteration and the filter cap increase in values is a concern about initial inrush or surge current and voltage exceeding the working capacity of the 450 volt capacitors. And so we see in both cases here we have 700 volts of operating voltage capability, and here we see 525. So I think they probably had some problems on the Brownface circuit with some of the electrolytics getting breached by high voltage. So they altered the circuit to give an extra 250 volts of voltage tolerance in the reservoir capacitance and another 75 volts of surge resistance in each of the electrolytic filter caps. Well, that's about it for the schematic review of the circuit of the Brownface Model 6G16 Vibroverb and a comparison between it and the updated Blackface version. One last little tidbit I'll give you of I think, interesting trivia is the Brownface, for whatever its shortcomings are, the Vibroverb was the first amplifier ever offered by a Fender that had both reverb and tremolo. Now, God knows they had the wrong tank driver tube and they had the wrong type of tremolo insertion, but you got to give them credit for trying. And my advice is to remember this little bit of trivia, and say when the family gets together next Thanksgiving, you're all sitting around the table and conversation is lagging a bit, just lay that one on them. Just say, did you know that the Brownface Vibroverb was the first Fender amp with both tremolo and reverb? And watch them just quiver in respect and admiration for your great knowledge. Now let's take a look at the internet to see if we can find any interesting photographs and information regarding our Model 6G16 Vibroverb amp. First off, I found an example of a Brownface Vibroverb very similar to the one that we're working on here on eBay. And if you notice, I know that sounds like a really high price, but that's less than half what these amps generally sell for. We'll see as we go down through the pictures that this one has had a replaced power transformer. Now they put in a mercury magnetics transformer, which, let's face it, was probably superior to the original Fender. But the fact that a major component has been changed greatly reduces the value of the amp. Let's go down through the pictures to see what the amp we're working on would look like if the chassis were reinstalled in the cabinet. You see the two original 10-inch Oxford speakers, looking at the rear control panel circuit, which is very clean and nice. It's a shame the power transformer failed. This would be an absolute gem if it were complete and intact. There you see it, the Mercury Magnetics power transformer replacement, and finally just one more shot of the chassis. Okay, so that's what it would look like. Let's take another look and see if we can't find any more examples on the internet. Here's Mitzi taking a little nap beside me as I do research on the computer. And another interesting discovery on reverb. There is currently a 1963 Brownface Fender Vibroverb for sale in beautiful shape. I have no idea the condition of the cabinet of the one that I'm currently working on here, but judging from the chassis, I bet it's this nice. And look at the price, about $20,000. Like I mentioned earlier, that's about what I paid for the first house I ever bought. Incredible. Let's take a look at some more pictures so we'll get a better understanding of what we're working on here. Here's the top view, the kind of standard Fender handle. It's got those side legs that tilt so that you can tilt the cabinet back and let the sound project upward into the room instead of having the bass frequencies lost in the carpet. Other side. Here's one of the two 10-inch Oxford, that's 465 Oxford speaker from 1963, and this would be the 10th week, I guess, of 1963. Looking at the circuit board, it looks identical to the one we're working on, except I don't believe that orange drop cap, you know, I'd have to go back out there and look, but it looks like that's been replaced. Everything else looks pretty straight. Of course, we're not buying this, okay, but it's nice to have a comparison. Tube chart, which I assume is intact and in good shape, and the one we're working on. And finally, a picture of the front control panel. Okay, so I thought you'd enjoy that little tour, and also the confirmation of the ungodly value of this particular amp. Now let's get back to work. Now that we've had our historical review of the Vibroverb evolution and significance, let's take a look at the particular model that we have right here before us. Take off the doghouse cover, which, look at the condition of this. Absolutely incredible. And we see that our all our 16 microfarad at 450 working volt Astron filter caps are present. And we see some hemorrhoids here starting to appear on this particular one. I have contacted the owner and had a long talk with him, and this is something we need to discuss, okay, before I go any further. I contacted him and told him that this amp, as it stands, unmolested, other than right here, and we're going to discuss this in just a minute, is worth a fortune. And I offered him the option of me not fixing it or changing anything and just simply selling it as is, okay, to some purist who would like to maintain it in this form. He declined and said no, that he bought this amp back in the early 70s. It's his amp, and he would like to be able to use it to relive his youth. He had many good years with this amp, and he wants to have some more years, and he does not want to sell it. He wants it to be made as reliable as possible while maintaining the appearance of originality. Now, that is going to entail me replacing these 5 electrolytic filter caps. Okay, now I don't really feel too bad about that because they are hidden under the doghouse cover, and from all external observation, that does not alter the original appearance of the amp. Secondly, as always, what I will do with this amp, and I'm really being careful about this because of the significance of this jewel, and that is I will be sure that all the original parts stay with the amp so that down the road, if somebody did want to put this back to completely original condition, for whatever reason, they would be able to do so quite easily. Okay, so with that said, please don't, start attacking my reputation and setting fire to my workshop because I dared to alter a Brownface Vibroverb. It is not irreversibly altered, and it is being altered for the owner so that he can use it. And honestly, I think that makes good sense. Now let's shift our attention to the output transformer issue. And I think you will see once we discuss this that the presence of this output transformer here sort of opens the door for further circuit modification, because this really is not a pristine, completely unaltered circuit. I checked the numbers on the bell and found that this is the output transformer for a super reverb. Okay, it is number 022855 or a part number 125A9A. Okay, now you might think, well, that's great because the super reverb had a little higher output. This might be a better output transformer, but such is not the case, because those of you who are familiar with a super reverb know that it uses 4 8-ohm speakers in parallel for a net speaker impedance of only 2 ohms. This particular output transformer then is looking for a 2 ohm speaker load, but it's not going to find it. It's going to find instead the 2 10-inch Oxford speakers that came with the amp, and therefore it's going to encounter double the speaker impedance that it is accustomed to seeing. The original Vibroverb output transformer was smaller than this. It is a number 022848. I had a part number 125A6A, and it had a net output impedance of 4 ohms to suit the 2 10-inch speakers that the Vibroverb amp came with. The Vibroverb output transformer has a winding ratio of 32 to 1. Now let's take a look. This is a review about winding ratios and matching impedance, and I think it might be helpful just to kind of review this to get it back fresh in our minds. Now, the original Vibroverb output transformer has a 32 to 1 winding ratio, which when you square it gives you an impedance ratio of 1,000. 32 squared is about 1,000. Okay, that means that if you apply the output to a 4 ohm speaker load, it will reflect 1,000 times that amount, or 4,000 ohms of impedance to the plates of the 6L6 output tubes, which is ideal. The super reverb, however, has a winding ratio not of 32 to 1, but of 44.5 to 1, which is, when we square it, equal to 2,000. So the impedance ratio is double in the super reverb. That means that if you attach a 2 ohm speaker load to it, as you should with the super reverb with 4 8-ohm speakers in parallel, it will reflect 2,000 times that amount, or 4,000 ohms of impedance to the plates of the output tubes. Again, that's ideal. But what happens when you apply the super reverb to a 4 ohm speaker load, as this amp has been doing? You're going to reflect 2,000 times that back, or 8,000 ohms of impedance to your 6L6 output tube plates. This is double what it should be. This will have an adverse effect on both volume and tone and life expectancy of the output transformer and possibly the tubes. So it's just not right. Okay, you could probably get away with it. Notice though that this amp is here for repair with some rather serious issues that have been brought up. Let's not rule out the possibility that this particular output transformer might not be the cause of some of those issues that this amp is presenting. So what I intend to do is track down the proper output transformer for this particular circuit. I want an output transformer that can handle 40 watts of output power and with a winding ratio of 32:1. I know what you're thinking. Good luck. If there's like 250 of these things in the world, that's of the Brownface version, how am I ever going to find one? Well, fortunately, some of Fender's other amps use this output transformer. So that helps me a great deal. Fortunately, which happens very rarely, Fender also used the 022-848 output transformer in the Vibrolux, Tremolux, and ultra rare Vibroverb. These first two are much more common. And because of that, I was able to track down through Reverb up in Portland, Oregon, a good used 022-848 output transformer. I have ordered this output transformer from a Reverb advertiser named Rooster, who's turned out to be just the salt of the earth, just a super nice fellow, and he's sending it second day air, so we should have it very soon. Okay, while we're waiting for the parts to arrive, let's go ahead and read the letter from the amp's owner to see if there's any specific complaints that we need to address. Greetings. I got this amp in about 1973, working at my uncle's Baltimore pawn shop on weekends and summers. I was like a kid in a candy shop. Can you imagine being in a pawn shop near a big city back then when gear was plentiful and dirt cheap? I cannot imagine a better opportunity to pick up good equipment. And he got this beauty with the family discount. Played it for a while, sounded great with the 210s, sort of tapered off on the use, put it in the closet. Then when he got it out, there was a lot of distortion on the vibrato channel. I switched to the normal channel and it worked fine. Okay, not many years later, I turned it on. There was a loud oscillating sound around 3,800 cycles per second, and the volume control had no effect, but the tremolo does. Okay, so that tells us that the source of the oscillation is between the volume control and the output tubes. Considered fixing it, but decided he'd send it to us. Okay, so here's a condensed list of the things to be done. Okay, install a 3-wire power cord, wire the primary properly, stop that oscillation, fix the distortion, replace, of course, any bad components, check the tubes. If any are bad, replace them with nice vintage tubes. I will if I can. If I don't, I'll have to order them. Switchable NFB loop. Fix the reverb tank problem. Apparently there's a rattle in the tank. Maybe a spring's come loose or there's some problem with the transducers. Bias the output tubes, of course. General going over, which is always done, especially during the audio testing where it's run at full operating temperature and voltage and current for like an hour or two to see if anything more can go wrong before I ship it back. Okay, and that's covered in number 10. So it seems pretty straightforward. We know we have specific information here, which is very helpful, and it's time to get started. Mitzi has decided that she likes her drinks right from the faucet in the kitchen sink. And no sooner do we finish the owner's letter when our replacement output transformer arrives from our good friend in Portland, Rooster Ross. And here is our replacement transformer, number 022-848, which is appropriate for the Vibroverb. We see the EIA code here, 606 for Schumacher, and the transformer was made in the 32nd week of 1967. Notice also that it is much smaller than the super reverb transformer, and that it only mounts with 2 legs and therefore 2 screw holes, and this is very troublesome. It does not mount with 4 legs and 4 screw holes like the replacement. Therefore, that means somebody drilled holes in this precious chassis to put in these 2 additional sheet metal screws. Very sad. We'll have to see if we can't do something about that. But rather than whine and gnash our teeth, let's go ahead and get started unwiring and unscrewing the improper replacement and installing the proper one. Now the 5 wires from the incorrect output transformer have been cleanly removed from the circuit, and you can see here the 2 big stainless steel screws that were put through the freshly drilled holes to install that super reverb transformer on this chassis. Very sad indeed. They'll soon be gone though. Out with the old, in with the new, and this gives you a little better perspective on the size difference between the two. Let's install this one. You know what, first though, I'm going to check for continuity in all of the windings. Everything checked out well. The secondary winding not only had continuity, but fairly low DC resistance, which is what you expect. The primary windings also show continuity, and not really a great match between the 2 half windings, but they never are all that well matched. But anyway, we have proven then that all windings are intact and that this output transformer for the Vibroverb should work. For comparison, I took the same readings on the super reverb transformer that came installed on the amp. As you can see, the secondary winding has even lower DC resistance, as do the 2 half windings of the primary. Although you really can't tell a great deal by DC resistance, what really matters is the winding ratio and impedance ratio. But I think it's very obvious that we have 2 very, very different output transformers here, and this one with the proper part number should give us the proper impedance match with the 2 10-inch speakers in the cabinet. Looking at the surface of the chassis, we see the nice clean spot where the original transformer was mounted with 2 legs, and also the fact that a lot of heat and soiling went on here before that transformer was replaced with the 4-legged super reverb transformer. Okay, so I'm going to try to find a decent way to try to fill in these holes. It won't be perfect because I really can't sand on the outside of this, you know, with fine sandpaper, but I'll do my best so that they don't just jump out and claw your eyes out, okay? Well, let's see how that goes. Thought a lot about using solder, JB Weld, whatever to fill the holes, but they'd still be filled holes. Instead, I got 2 round head Phillips screws that fit right in with the others on the chassis, and aged them with gun glue and screwed them into place so that I really think that's a lot less obtrusive than holes filled with solder. Okay, now let's get back to installing our output transformer. I spent about 20 minutes going through all my old vintage hardware, and I found a pair of nice toothed lock washers for the screws to hold the output transformer to the chassis. Here's the new output transformer installed on the chassis. Wires are run through the grommets. Now let's flip this jewel over and wire it up. Well, the 022848 output transformer is wired in place. Black goes to the speaker jack ground, green goes to the output blade. Over here we have blue to the right 6L6 plate. We have brown to the left plate, and red goes over to the B+. I decided to get busy while waiting for the delivery of the electrolytic capacitors, and besides installing that replacement output transformer, which we've already discussed, I replaced the 470 ohm screen resistors, and I partially rewired the socket so that I could install 1500 ohm grid blockers. I think that that's really a good idea in the circuit. The Brownface Vibroverb did not have the grid blockers, and remember that the owner complained of oscillation. Well, this is one good way to stop. I also detached the depth cap and then installed a really snazzy 3-wire power cord that's rayon covered. The brown color and the brown color of the plug really go well with the control panel of the amp. With that 3-wire power cord, I rewired the whole primary circuit appropriately. And I made sure that the ground wire was the longest of the 3. And I also soldered the green grounding wire to the chassis. Also, I'm keeping track of each of the changes that I make to the circuit. I'm going to write them down neatly and keep them in the doghouse with the electrolytic filter caps to guide someone if they want to restore the amp back to its original circuitry. The new electrolytic capacitors arrived today, so now it's time to replace the old herniated electrolytics under the doghouse. If you recall from my previous discussion of the shortcomings of the Brownface Vibroverb circuit, remember that having all 5 of the electrolytics after the standby switch was really not the hot setup. So what I'm going to do is change it so that it's more like the AB763 Deluxe Reverb arrangement, in which the reservoir caps are still in parallel. They're 16s at 450, but they are before the standby switch. Then afterwards will be the 3 remaining filter caps. The 5 new mod electrolytics are all installed. You'll notice they are 16 microfarads, not at 450 volts, but 475 volts. Just a little bit of a margin of protection there against voltage surges. I also lifted up the insulated eyelet board to make sure that the 2 reservoir caps here were completely isolated from the other. So now I can move the standby switch after the 2 parallel reservoir caps. And to do that, you see here is the red high voltage wire that's coming to energize the 2 reservoir caps. Let's flip the chassis over, look underneath, and see where that wire connects to the circuit. I've got the chassis flipped over. We're looking at the red wire from the 2 reservoir caps in parallel, where it comes in here to get the high voltage when this wire is energized by the standby switch. So the high voltage will come up here and it will energize the center tap of the output transformer, the filter choke, and the reservoir caps. We see that that is the case here when the switch is closed. Filter choke, center tap of the output transformer, and reservoir caps. So what I will do is disconnect that red wire from this eyelet, add an extension to it, bring it down here to the hot side of the standby switch, so that when you turn on the power to the amplifier, the high voltage will flow from the GZ34 to this side of the standby switch, and it will energize the 2 parallel reservoir caps. And there is our wire coming up here to the hot side of the standby switch that will energize our 2 reservoir caps. And to verify that the wiring is correct, I've connected one lead of my ohmmeter to pin 8 of the GZ34, where the high voltage goes to the standby switch, and I'll connect the other lead here to the positive end of the reservoir cap, and you see that there is continuity regardless of the position of the standby switch. By the same token, I'll come over here and connect to one of the 3 electrolytic filter caps, and we see that there is no connection until I flip the standby switch. Okay, so I believe that verifies that the wiring is correct. The next step is to replace all 6 of the cathode bypass caps and test every single resistor in the circuit. I found 2 of the carbon comp resistors were out of spec and replaced them. Next, I'm going to flip it over and start testing the tubes. And once we install a good tube set, I will check for leakage on the coupling caps, and then we'll be ready for our audio demo. Also, as the owner requested, I have rewired the polarity switch to act as a switchable NFB loop. Okay, so in this position here, the NFB loop is in effect as it is in the original circuit, and in this position there is no NFB loop. 5 of the 12 AX7s or 7025s all tested out just fine. There's one weak tube, and that's sadly the tongue saw 7025. So I'm going to replace it with a good vintage tube. The 2 vintage General Electric 606 GCs test out just fine. Just as with the Super Reverb in the video that preceded this one, instead of the GZ34 rectifier, we have a 5U4. Okay, the performance of the GZ34 is far superior, higher plate voltage, higher plate current, and a nice slow startup, which you don't get with the 5U4. So I believe I'm going to have to order a GZ34 for this amp. You know, there's one more component we got to check on, and that is the status of the reverb tank. Apparently there's some weird rattling noises that would imply that a spring was loose, so let's open it up and take a look. Well, here's the tank, all bright and shiny, but I'm very sad to report that one of the springs did indeed become detached from the unit, and when it did, it tore the little Alnico magnets out of both ends of the transducer units. So there's no doubt about it. I'll have to order a replacement tank and then probably install the modern transducer units in the original tank housing. Okay, so one more part to order. Tubes are all installed in their respective sockets. I'm plugged into the current limiter to protect the circuit from shorts. Output is going to the 12-inch shop speaker. Input is 300 cycles per second from the signal generator into the normal channel. Let's take it off standby. Check our bulb. No glowing. Let's turn up our volume a bit. Sounds good. It's working. I don't hear any oscillation. Oh man. Oh, that sounds terrible. Let's see if the tremolo is working. Yes, it is. Works quite well. Finally, let's take a look at the bias of our output tubes, and it looks like this one here is about giving up the ghost. This one's weak, and I think this really low bias on these output tubes is a function of their age and inability to flow proper plate current, and that is what's giving us that hideous shrill nasal sound that we're getting. I need to check my tube stash, get a decent, fairly well matched pair of 6L6s, and let's see if we can't get this jewel to sound a whole lot better. And then, as if by magic, we have our matched pair of 6L6 GCs from Antique Electronic Supply. Let's open the boxes, get out the tubes, and see how they work in our restored amplifier circuit. All right, we have our matched pair of 6L6 GCs installed. I've taken the amp off of standby, and we have a very nice tone from our, in this case, 200 cycle per second signal generator output. And you see that although the bias is still very cold on this pair of tubes, we have a much better balance between the two tubes. So I think now we're going to have to boost the plate current up to probably 35 or 40 milliamps to get the proper tone from our new output tubes. But meanwhile, listen to the difference already compared to that very kind of nasal, annoying sound that we were getting before. The readings that I've been getting have been taken with the 5U4 rectifier in place. And as you can see, the plate current is rather low. Okay, so our first step in boosting this plate current will be to switch from a 5U4 to the GZ34 rectifier. And now with our brand new GZ34 rectifier, we see that we've jumped up, well, close to 3 milliamps of plate current and about 14 to 16 plate volts. A nice step in the right direction. Now let's plug into our wall AC outlet instead of into our current limiter. And now plugged into the AC outlet, we see that we've gone up about another milliamp of plate current and maybe 5 or 6 plate volts. Okay, so it looks like we're still going to have to go in and adjust our bias a bit to get us up more to like the 35 to 40 milliamps of plate current. And here's a quick review of the plate current readings and plate voltage readings as we went from the 5U4 to the GZ34 to wall AC supply. Now, as I said, we're going to adjust the bias itself to try to get this plate current up closer to the 35 to 40 milliamp range. And how will we do that, you ask? Well, we look here at the negative DC bias supply, and we see that some of it is being allowed to leak to ground through a 33K resistor. Now, the more that leaks, the less will come up here to give a negative grid bias. So what we want to do, because our plate current is too low, is reduce this resistance and let a little more of our negative DC bias supply go to ground so that less of it reaches our grids. Okay, so let's try that. Okay, let's go ahead and put in say a 28K or thereabouts resistor and see how that affects our bias. Well, after dropping that 33K grounding resistor down to 22K, we see that we have pretty acceptable plate current and plate voltage readings for our 6L6 GCs. And let me turn up the volume a little. Our tremolo works better than ever. As we said earlier, proper bias is really essential for the tremolo to work when you're adjusting the bias of the output tube. I'm now working on the reverb tank. I demonstrated all of this in great detail in a previous video, but what I've done is to remove the tray from each of the reverb tanks, and I drilled out the transducers from the original tray in the original tank and replace them with the transducers from the new mod tank. So now we have the original Vibroverb reverb tank tray, but with brand new transducers on either end. Now I'll go ahead, I'm going to hook up the springs and then wire the transducers, and we should have a perfectly good functioning reverb tank that looks every bit as it did originally, other than, of course, the transducers. There's the assembled reverb tank from the Vibroverb with its newly installed transducers and one new spring. I'm going to double check the impedance of each of the jacks, and then I believe this is ready to go back in the bag and to be tested with the amplifier. There goes the reverb tank, reunited with its wood and cardboard base, sliding into the cleaned up tank bag and almost ready for testing. Well, all the repairs are finished, and I increased the output to bias up a bit, much closer to 40 milliamps. So I think that the amp is ready for audio testing. It will be done in our standard method with the single 12-inch shop speaker. Also, the input will be from P90 single coil pickups. See what you think. Well, I guess that's about it for this rather lengthy video on the very rare and valuable 1963 Fender Vibroverb amp. I feel guilty after enumerating all the shortcomings of the circuit, and then to find that it has absolutely fantastic tone, that the tremolo works perfectly, and the reverb is as good as I've ever heard. So it just shows you can't always tell a book by the cover. I hope you enjoyed the video and that you'll stay tuned for future postings from Rusty's workshop. I want to take a few moments here to thank all our Patreon patrons and PayPal contributors for keeping us on the air for another month. Should you choose to join them in supporting our channel, I'll include links in the video description which will enable you to do so. So as we start packing up this fabulous old vintage amp to return to its owner, we bid you all a fond farewell, and we hope to see you again in the near future. Bye for now.